School of Theology, professor of homiletics, and I also teach practical theology, so it's a unique honor for me to welcome our guest, Dr. Mary McClintock Fulkerson at the Divinity School at Duke University. So first of all, let me greet you directly, Dr. Fulkerson. Thank you for coming today and being a part of our webinar. We've had a bit of a trial, but we've made it through the trial, so I take that to heart. So welcome.
Thank you.
So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about you and then invite the people in the room to introduce themselves.
Can you all see me?
Everyone see and hear her okay? Good. I think we're in good shape that way. And you can hear me okay?
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm careful when I do.
Yeah, you're on now and the eye is unblinking. Yeah, good luck with that. So we have most of our group assembled here. There may be some more who arrived during the time. But I want to at least speak about the fact that you're here with us. I want to mention, for example, that a little bit about your prior work, because that sets a trajectory for, I think, what we'll be talking about today. Dr. Fulkerson's first work that I know about, published monograph, is Changing the Subject, Women's Discourses in Feminist Theology, which was a very influential book in my field of homiletics. It impacted people who were looking at homiletics of testimony, and also theologies of preaching. I'm not sure if you were even aware of that, but
No.
already your early work has had an impact. However, the main reasons we're here today are two of her more recent works. Ostensibly, the reason we gather here today is to discuss this new book, A Body Broken, A Body Betrayed, Race, Memory, and Eucharist in White Dominant Churches. And she's co-authored this book with Marcia Mount-Shoup. Just came out from Whitman Stock, I think, last year. And so that's one reason why we're here today. I have to say, one reason we're convening the Track 3 Doctoral Colloquium in Practical Theology on this book is that I'm doing a little research on a theology of word and sacrament, and so I found the work so interesting. But I hope my selfishness won't obstruct everyone else's interest in what they're here for today. But interestingly, I think this book takes up some of the themes that showed up also in your earlier work, Places of Redemption, which came out, I believe, 2007, is that right? From Oxford? Something like that.
I'll have to look.
Okay, I can't vouch for the date, but I think a very important book in the way it uses place theory, issues around race and identity.
Yes, 2007.
2007. And a remarkable book, too, in terms of how you relate ethnography to the theological task. You and I had a fun conversation on Friday talking a little bit about this. I guess I've always viewed you as a constructive theologian. I guess from our conversation that you see that as still a little bit in process. Mm-hmm. But I want to acknowledge that as a theologian operating within your own research trajectory, you've convened, I think, a strong conversation among many practical theologians, which is why, first of all, I welcome you here today, and I'm so happy to invite you to be a part of our discussion. So welcome again.
Well, it's a real honor, it really is.
Okay. So what I would like to do is to have my colleagues introduce themselves. These are faculty and students who are in practical theology here at VU School of Theology. And I'll let my colleague Courtney Goto begin.
Hi, I'm Courtney Goto. Dr. Fulkerson, I think we met at AAR a number of years ago, but nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good, thank you.
I teach in religious education and practical theology.
Wow.
My name is Chris, and I'm in the Practical Theology PhD program in my exam year. I've been interested. Thank you for the sympathetic groans in the room. Very welcome. I'm very interested in the relationship between ethnography and theology, and my research will focus on an ecumenical partnership between the United Church of Christ and a South American Pentecostal denomination in Chile.
Hi, my name is Shin from South Korea, and I'm the second year PhD student in practical theology, and my research interest is cross-cultural religious education.
Oh, right.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Beal, and I'm a second year PhD student in practical theology, also interested in psychoanalysis, how theology, pastoral theology can foster healing intersubjectivity, especially in regard to the damage done through intersectional relationship harm, such as racism, gender, sexism, those type of problems.
My name is Dave Penn. I just finished my exam year, so I'm on to the prospectus phase now, and I am looking at the future of youth spiritual and moral development in mainline denominations.
Oh, no small thing.
Hi, my name's Dan Hauge. I'm in my second year. I'm actually looking at enculturated whiteness and how it affects Christian institutions. So this was one of the most recent book I read and felt, well, I don't have to do anymore. But I am trying to take a little bit more of a developmental psychology angle at the question too. So.
Right.
Hi, my name is Catherine House, and I am in my 6th year, writing year. I'm working on my dissertation, and my interests are, my dissertation is focusing on soteriologies and how they sort of show up in campaigns for sexual purity. So, and specifically paying attention to intersections around race and gender and how that conversation happens, and sort of intersecting with real specific theological constructions. So, really excited about this work, and also your other work has been really important in my own research. So, excited to be here.
Hey. Could you recognize my face? I'm always not really
You
good.
all are about this small. I mean, it's really hard to see. But.
Yeah. I teach practical theology, and let's see, immigrant theology, and also post-colonialism is my recent work. Yep.
And hi there, Mary. I'm Mary Elizabeth Moore, and it's great to see you. I
Yes.
teach at the intersection of theology, the social sciences, and education.
Oh, yes, wow.
And we're so thrilled you're here with us. Thank you so much for this.
Kind.
Dr. Fulkerson, 2 more brief introductions. You'll notice on the left side of your screen in the chat room we have 2 students, Dusei Lee and Samniel Kim. Dusei Lee is a homiletics concentration PhD student in practical theology who's interested in interpretive communities and looking at sort of a post-structuralist view of preaching. Samniel Kim is in the concentration of religious education and is looking at the intersection of doctrine and narrative, among other things. They will be participating perhaps by asking questions in the chat room, which I'll be relaying to you as we finish up your presentation at the beginning. But just so you know, there will be questions and comments here in the room. There may be questions and comments online, and that will be all part of the process. But at this point, I want to turn it over to you and invite you to share a little bit about the question I was posing last week or so when I would like to hear about your research. The 2 books we've highlighted today are certainly very important to me, and in teaching practical theology here, it struck me that there were a lot of students who were very interested in your way of bringing together elements of place theory, critical race theory, and also elements of what you're doing with how you integrate that in your work with ethnography. So at this point, I'd just like to turn it over to you and hear you talk about these 2 most latest works that you've done, and have a chance to hear about how you see your research and how you do your work. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to give you a little background as to what got me into what I have done and doing. It's hard for me to clearly locate myself in the terms of standard or traditional theology, although I suppose practical in its most general sense, that would be a good descriptor. But let me say what generated my interests, or my so-called academic work. I mean, my initial understanding, I got my PhD at Vanderbilt, And the theologian that's had most impact on me and all my work has been Edward Farley. Are many people familiar with his work?
Yes.
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 You? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so I started out assuming theology was about belief in the cognitive. I think my experience, and I wasn't a feminist, when I got a job at Duke Divinity School as a faculty person, before I had even written my dissertation, I mean, you know, sometimes you just can't turn down the job, but that was a little difficult. I wasn't a feminist, but being the only woman on the faculty at Duke, I turned into it. You know, I like guys. I'm not being, you know, hateful here, but there were some people who did not like, or I began to recognize the invisibility of a whole population, to put it mildly. So I started doing feminist theology. My first book was, let's see, Changing the Subject, which, because my dissertation was just not on anything in particular, but I
Are you sure?
but,
Are you sure?
but when I wrote Changing the Subject, I was paying attention to different groups than had been looked at by standard white feminist theology. So I did a focus on Presbyterian women. I did some travel up into Appalachia, and it was sort of random travel. I mean, this was pre-academic kind of study of a group. But I got to know a few Appalachian white women up at a conference I went to in Appalachia. And so I decided to write on both of those groups, and it's distinct from what was called, you know, standard feminist theology, although we have to add white now to much of that theology because it's an unacknowledged marker. What I discovered that has mattered for me ever since is that the use and the function of Christian tradition can be very different than what I had learned about as an academic. And that it really mattered to pay attention to what even oppressive kind of themes and doctrines, how they might be creatively employed by women, for example. So that was one of my primary focuses in that first book, was how can we look at a group like, you know, Presbyterian women who are ordered, their lives seem to be ordered around the domestic, which from a feminist perspective is so oppressive, or, you know, can be oppressive. How can I take that seriously and honor these women and recognize the way in which they might be creatively using the image of the domestic? And the same for the Appalachian women, who were very much lower income. They were part of a very patriarchal, Pentecostal religious group, and yet they were able to use some of Pentecostalism as a rationale for sort of free travel. I mean, that's the one thing I remember being really fascinated by, how they would get pushback from the Pentecostal males who were dominating, and yet they would argue, it's not me, the Holy Spirit working through me. Now, I don't want to romanticize patriarchal versions of Christianity, but it did seem to me important to feminist thinking to take seriously the creative way in which human beings in all sorts of oppressive cultures may be employing their traditions. And of course, that's not news to you, I'm sure. But it is a push to expand what counts as theological in ways that are still being developed. I mean, how do we take seriously the other dimensions of a tradition than simply its cognitive or belief focus dimensions? And I ended up finding out about new categories from Paul Connerton's work later. The notion of practices of inscription and incorporative practices, which if you've read some of my stuff, you will be aware of. And I think Connerton's work is being used more, hopefully, by theologians now. But practices of inscription are what we tend to think of as about faith, you know, written and savable kinds of discourses. Practices of incorporation, generally speaking, refer to communications that are sent or performed in bodily practices. And I found those categories enormously helpful because, as I've indicated in my book on an interracial church, I had bodily habituations about which I had been totally unaware. And I opened the book by talking about how I walk in, do this ethnography of this interracial church, and I am, I think, one of, if not the only white person in the room, and I feel really uncomfortable. Well, that was extremely embarrassing. But it wasn't unusual, and it helped me discover and explore Paul Connerton's category of incorporative practices. And that's just one example of the function of incorporative practices, or the kind of bodily habituations that may be at great odds with what you say and think your beliefs are. And in that case, they certainly were. My discomfort, being the only white person, was at great odds with my so-called, or what I would have said, was liberal, welcoming, you know, all people of all races need to be welcome. So, a step back, one of my, a person I was going to church with, and this was way back after I'd written Changing the Subject, was an anthropologist. She taught at UNC Chapel Hill. And she happened to have read some of Changing the Subject because she was doing ethnographic work in Appalachia. And she said to me, if you're going to be writing about, as a theologian, about, you know, these practices and so forth, really, it would be much better if you did ethnography. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, I didn't really know anything about it. But I ended up taking a course from her that she was teaching at UNC on ethnography. So I've only had one course in ethnography. I'm certainly not an expert, but it was enormously helpful to me to go on and do the participant observation at the church, the interracial church that I chose. And it was, of course, the church that also included people with disabilities in it. So that kind of work really opened up for me other modes of communication that I had never been aware of before. And of course, if you read any of the Places of Redemption, I do talk about the way in which the people with cognitive disabilities, the people from so-called group homes, were part of this community and yet were perceived and would be perceived by most predominantly white churches that I'm aware of as disruptive. You know, they're certainly not, I mean, I've only been to one church that includes people like that, and excuse me, their behavior would disrupt a lot of white Presbyterians, at least in my own experience. So I discovered then, of course, that there were all sorts of categories that theology needs to take seriously. I think the category of practices became a very important category. That's clearly a really important category now. It's getting more and more complexified by theologians, and that's a good thing, because we can't simply think of, here's another issue that gets raised, tradition as practices of inscription, or our inherited, written, biblical, post-biblical, creedal, etc. kind of material. That is not all tradition is. Now, the challenge to how to define Christian tradition in relationship to incorporative practices, in other words, what were the bodily practices, the bodily modes of communication operative, back around Thomas Aquinas? Or do you need to look at somebody besides Thomas Aquinas in order to have a significant appropriation or awareness of what would have been incorporative practices back in the Middle Ages, or all the different, what in my experience being trained as a theologian, what has counted as a tradition? How would you flesh that out in a literal sense? Or would you have to go somewhere besides these famous theologians and traditionalists in order to really take tradition seriously? I'd love to hear people's, thoughts on that, or their work on that. I think, let's see, the new book, the book that Marcia and I wrote was an attempt to try to take some of the concerns that we have had about bodies and the function of bodily communication seriously through the practice of Eucharist. And, to put it rather crassly, I think we have had the sense that for some theologies, Eucharist is just too romanticized. Now, that doesn't mean it has profound insights and ends, telos, and we affirm that, or we want to affirm that, but we weren't convinced that the way it's practiced is always enacting the meanings that it is intended to display. I have a wonderful colleague, Chuck Campbell, who's talked about communion with homeless people and what it means to sit out on the street and share food with homeless people. He is interpreting that as communion, and I have found that very insightful. Now, of course, that's easy to say, but how do you really literally flesh that out as a ritual? Because rituals are important, obviously. Having strategies or practices that can continue to serve as lenses that open up the contemporary situation and how God is present in that, or what God is calling us toward, through images like sharing meals, brokenness of Jesus' body and the death on the cross and resurrection. How to enact that in a regular fashion, but enact it in a way that really opens up reality in a new way, to me is a huge challenge. I mean, I've been going to an interracial church since I finished that book on the ethnography, and it's made a lot of difference for me to be in a church, not just because I go to church on Sunday and sit with some, bodies of a different race. That wouldn't be enough. We have conversations, ongoing conversations in a group that I've been in for 6 years in the church, where we actually discuss our experience, when did we first become aware of race? And that's been enormously useful. I don't want to romanticize that either, but it's opened up very honest conversations, not just about the abstraction of race, racism, etc., and sexism, but also our own experiences of that, and they have been very different. I mean, I grew up as a white woman in, the South, an all-white church, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I've talked a lot. So I could say more, like about white bodily proprieties, ownership of space. What does it really mean to have that transgressed in a constructive way? But let me stop there. New insights, questions, challenges.
So what is the most distinctive different experience that you have between?
I'm sorry, it's hard to hear.
Okay, so what would be the most distinctive experience that you experience in the comparison with your previous white church than this current church? You said you are now participating in the interracial church, right?
Yeah.
So what would be the most distinctive character or feature that you experience in that congregation now?
That's a hard question to answer because I've been going there for 14 years. Let's see. I think sharing our stories has been the most significant, and that's in the Pauli Murray group. Did I mention that it was the Pauli Murray group?
In the book.
In the book, yeah.
And to tell my own story of growing up as a white girl in the South, as I just said, and telling embarrassing stories like, when I was growing up, the African American people I pretty much saw were maids. M-A-I-D-S. I mean, how embarrassing is that? And then I've heard stories from my colleagues in this group about what it felt like to grow up in a very different kind of home, where they were warned by their parents about, when you go these places, you've got to be careful about and avoid white people. I mean, we're talking about a generation, too. I mean, I'm talking about people who are more in my generation. And some of the experiences, of course, have changed, but that's been one of the most significant things about my experience. Does that get at what you were asking? Hello?
Yeah. One thing I would like to ask you about is, for me, what was so striking about the Places of Redemption is some of the descriptions you made in visiting that church at the beginning of your book, and the way you use the language of habituation. And I'm wondering, who are you looking at and who's helping you understand habituation? Any theories of practice that informed your development there? Because it was, that particular discussion at the beginning of the book was a real eye-opener for me personally. And if there's any way I think that coming to terms with my own whiteness, I would say that book was key in many ways, just because of the way it used in the language of habituation. So I'd like to hear you speak a little bit more about that and theories of practice and how that relates also to race identity.
Yeah, I think when I wrote this book, I hadn't read some of the more recent literature on habituation, whiteness, et cetera, and now I'm going to go blank. Who are some of those? You all have probably read some.
Well, when I was reading that, I was thinking of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, yeah.
That's true, right. Yeah, and that was helpful. I didn't read a lot of that, but it was just enough to make me shift my attention to my body and the way I was reacting. I was just trying to think of the more recent especially theologically trained folks who have written on white habituation. And now I'm blanking.
Well, Ted Smith is one person who's done a lot of work
Yeah.
in theories of
Yeah.
practice as they relate to
Yes, right.
practical
And
theological disciplines.
the whole,
As they relate to practical theological disciplines, he's one name that comes to
Right.
mind. And one
Right.
other person you
who have
mentioned.
you found helpful?
Well, I find this language of habituation itself very helpful, and I'm kind of intrigued by the way Bourdieu does a reading of practice that's more conflict oriented. When I think back to the way Hauerwas uses McIntyre, and I remember you did that actually in the Word and the Sacrament book, where you talked about the way in which the idealized way we talk about Eucharistic practice sometimes assumes that there's like a unidirectional move about how practice forms us that is sort of occludes the very conflicted relationships of sort of the is and the ought of Eucharistic practice, or the idealized, romanticized version and what's happening in bodies.
Yeah, are you talking, Stanley has done the romanticization?
Or that I would say that theologians who appropriate McIntyre often offer sort of romantic visions of how things like those sorts of practices form Christian faith.
Yeah.
I'll add on to that. There's an ethicist whose name is Rebecca Gordon, and she wrote a book called Mainstreaming Torture. And it's really interesting. She has pretty feminist, pretty strong liberationist commitments, writing from California, and had been involved with some revolutionaries in South America. And she also works with McIntyre in this really interesting way as far as naming torture as a false practice. And so she does this really work that was really helpful to me, kind of for a whole different project, but really unpacking practice, really working with McIntyre, but saying, is torture a practice? Is it a false practice? And why does that matter? But using her analysis towards a really powerful kind of ends of saying, we think it's invisible, really pointing out what makes a practice invisible. Saying, the fact that it's very normal. This is very normal. We think but we only pay attention when it's so striking that we're doing these things. She's like, no, actually there's a whole system in place that is making this function the whole time, but it bubbles up. And so for me, it's been really helpful to think about that in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of other practices that are really sort of underground, dealing with race and gender, and when they pop up, what is it that we're really noticing as far as practice? But she kind of comes to mind as somebody who's using something pretty traditional, quote unquote, in a new way that was insightful for me.
Wow, that sounds, and what's her name again?
Her name is Rebecca Gordon.
Gordon, okay. Sounds good, yeah. And obviously, to simply stay at the level of practices is inadequate, because practices are part of larger social structures, et cetera, institutional, and which, if you go there, you can sometimes feel like, oh, okay, we can't change anything, that's too huge. But on the other hand, the complexities of practices and what they are both helping reproduce, but also not an adequate avenue into what change would require. Anyway, I think it's a good start for theology, though, to shift to those kinds of, categories for what human experience is about or entails. So. Any other questions?
One thing that's challenged me a lot, it's interesting. I mean, I grew up PC USA, and so the way that you describe the communion in the book is very familiar, and in some ways why. But anyway, moving out of that's a different. Probably a sidebar. My more experience in the last 10 to 12 years in interracial church myself, and partly engaging in practices pretty close to what you describe in chapter 5, in terms of discussion group.
Which book?
The most recent book, Body
Okay.
Broken, Body Betrayed. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the practices you described in the most recent book, whether it's discussion groups or whether it's a more differently structured form of Eucharist, they've been invaluable to me. So have just simply informal conversations, extended informal conversations over time, over simply being part of a community takes a process of at least a few years to kind of dislodge my habituations, and that process is ongoing. That it's not something that isolated rituals can do. But as I've done that, and as I recognize how invaluable that's been, I'm always struggling with the alternate question of the burden that those practices often put on people of color to do the teaching, to create those welcoming spaces. And when we're encouraging, or when I'm encouraging white people to enter the kind of spaces I've been in, or to take those kinds of steps, there's always kind of the converse reality of how much are we reproducing or causing even more stress and trauma on our brothers and sisters of color. And I guess I just wonder how you think about that in terms of the ramifications of these kind of, it's one thing to talk about how this helps dislodge white habituations. It's another thing to talk about how it's actually making more.
That has been on my mind for a really long time, and funny, I just brought it up again. Oh, let's see, yesterday was Sunday. I brought it up yesterday with my co-leader at church, who's an African American woman. She and I have both been leading the Polly Murray discussion group at our church for 6 years. And the worry is, as I understand what you're saying, it's sort of like, I felt like, oh, here I am, a white person going to a black church to get them to help make me feel better. Because I won't feel so guilty if I'm, going to a black church. Or, why should we, in fact, I was saying to Leonida yesterday, Leonida N., she's an NPR, National Public Radio journalist, and I said, it feels to me sort of like we're asking you as African Americans to fix us. And she laughed. That's an ongoing conversation. There's no, I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer. I'm just sharing with you that it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. I don't know that there's such a thing as the right thing to do. What I'm not going to stop doing this because I'm hopefully learning from as well as supporting people who I go to church with. And I can't romanticize that because it's as you've already suggested, has its own problems associated with it.
This question might be closely related to that. Can you hear me okay? Or should I come? Okay. The timing of this book and this conversation is really intriguing to me because just yesterday in my very white church that self-identifies as progressive Baptist within the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, actually not far from you, it's in Shelby, North Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I flew up here from there yesterday, or this morning, but nevertheless, just yesterday, my church welcomed an African American church into to share the Sunday morning service in our church building. Apparently we might reciprocate at some point in the future, but their building is much, much smaller, and so there's some kind of space issues and racial issues that resonate there. But I found it intriguing that the African American pastor who came and preached the sermon that day used the term colorblind as sort of a redemptive concept. And so that stands in such tension to what we're reading here. And I've also heard that, I don't know if it's James Cone or other African American theologians that have said this doesn't, the black liberation theology doesn't seem to be filtering down to the level of popular religion in the African American churches sometimes. But I wondered what we as white people can do to maybe foster, I guess I don't even know the right question to ask in this regard. When white theology is saying colorblindness can be a problem, and a black pastor is coming in and saying God is colorblind, and I'm a young practical theologian saying, what do I do with this?
Right. Great observation and question. I have to remind myself that when I started doing ethnography, I had to start shutting up. Because it was just too easy for me to assume I could use all these words and they would be understood in terms of what connotations they had, as well as what, literally they meant. So my first reaction to what you're suggesting is, or what you're talking about is, that we have to listen to other people and figure out what they think. Not in a way that suggests that, we're the really smart ones and we just need to shut up for a while, but in the way that we need to understand people who are different. Better than we do. We never will completely. We never will. I'm not answering your question other than agreeing that this is part of reality, that we can't ever assume, when we're with people who are of different social locations, that we know the way they think about things. When I was going back and rereading some of the book, because I hadn't read it in ages, Places of Redemption, and remembering some of the people and how it was so typical of me to assume stuff about what they would think, et cetera, and I would be wrong. But, and that's more about race, class, sexual orientation, et cetera. But that's a generalization. What other thoughts do you have about it?
Well, okay. I'm new to the church, and so it's a little hard for me to place it. So I think your advice is brilliant, to listen and learn and try to understand, because I don't know the white church very well, let alone know the African American church very well, or what brought them together, why, how that works. How did we split up the offering that day, if we did? There's so many things I just don't know. But so the listening component is really important. Which kind of leads to my second question was, I wonder if you have ideas about starting conversations like the one that you're engaged in long term with the group that you are part of. I don't know if you helped found that. Do you see those sorts of groups happening in other places? Any thoughts on how to foster those kind of conversations where we get to listen more intentionally?
Yeah. Boy, that would be great if these kind of groups came up. And one of the reasons I think this group is great, and because it's very unusual, is that it's organized around a project that was started at Duke and in Durham too, around an African American woman who grew up here. And there are not many, widely appreciated by, all whites and the public imagination stories of African American women. I'm not saying there aren't any, but when you think of who's famous in American history, it's mostly white men. And Pauli Murray was a real groundbreaker. She grew up in Durham, some of her her great-grandfather and stuff were white slave owners in Chapel Hill who raped their slaves. She was just sort of this fearless woman. How many of you all have heard of her?
Not until reading
Anybody?
your book.
No, first time reading
Okay.
your.
Well, she was amazing, and using her story would be like, I don't know, a story of who would be an analogous white guy who was famous that you grew up learning about in church. Anybody?
Brian Stone.
Who?
No, exactly. John Wesley?
So that's what our group organized around, was her story. And she's written material. She became the first African-American woman Episcopal priest, but she was a lawyer who did a lot of the work around desegregation laws. She didn't get the credit for it, a guy did, but she was fearless and did some amazing things, was part of all sorts of protests, and has written about that. And she was also lesbian, and her story, just to have this become a more public story, because one of the things that we've done in Durham, since she grew up in Durham, is have some public conversations around her life, like down at the library, the public library, and ask people to talk about their own experience growing up in Durham around race or around sexual orientation, etc. So while that's nothing that's radically changing reality, it's still a really helpful set of strategies to alter many imaginations. And doing it in church, obviously because she was a priest, but because of her life, she was always a Christian. Just using her story to get people to share their own stories, I think could be interpreted theologically. So it's a great idea. I don't know whether your church would want to read about Paul and Murray, or if you could discern other women, African American or otherwise, in your own home community. I don't know.
I have a comment and a question. So the comment relates to Matt's question, and that's when I read A Body Broken, I had thought about how useful this would be to discuss in an Asian American church, for example.
Oh.
Because I know your audience is primarily
Say
white.
more, say more.
But that just knowing you're identifying the habits of white folks around the Eucharist is really helpful, because we have inherited much of that in Asian churches and Asian American churches in ways that we don't even recognize. And so to have that named was an eye-opener for me, because I thought, wow, and it helped me to think about internalized racism and how some of what we've internalized actually we're using kind of white theology that works against being critical of racism, and actually, so you often hear in some Asian American churches a lot of language that we've picked up around inclusivity, for example, and so it helps in a culture of forgetting and motivation toward integration, assimilation, just as opposed to thinking more critically and about our own distinctiveness. So I do think you're making a contribution to those kinds of conversations.
You're
So
kind.
So here's a different direction, going back to your previous book on Places of Redemption, which I work with in a current project called Taking on Practical Theology. And what I want to know is whether you ever, what kind of benefit did the Good Samaritan Church receive from your research?
Great question. did not, let's see, the church has changed so much since the version that I wrote about that I can't, it's hard for me to even, it's hard for me to even think of anybody who's still in the church who was there back when I did that, because the church has been, see, it's a Methodist church, and it got shrunk down, shrank down so much that it got joined with another church, and a bunch of people left, and so it's really not the same church. I think that's not to be an avoidance kind of response. I'm not sure that they have benefited. People who are actually part of the group that I wrote about were glad to do it, or seemed glad, but you know, what benefit they have received is, you know, I can't say they've gotten one, and that suggests the sort of, what would be the way to put it, the risk that academics are always engaged in, which is being voyeurs and benefiting from a practice that is ostensibly about something else. Ostensibly, this was about, you know, being Christians together and confessing our own limitations and being open to being changed. And I don't like to think of myself as just a voyeur, like I was just using these people to get a book so I could get, you know, tenure or promoted or whatever. But I can't not confess that that was always part of it. And perhaps at some level, that's why I never left the church. Because I didn't want to, I've already said that. What ideas might come out of, you know, what could have been beneficial? One might be, well, could we use some of our recognitions of the limitations and the insights and the valuing of different gifts in the community to have more public conversations about this? I mean, that would have been potentially useful. And getting people to read your book. Of course, one of my problems has been sometimes I write so academically that, you know, it puts people to sleep. Non-academic people. Like my husband has tried to read a book or two of mine, and then he'll just, you know. Get what I'm saying? Too much theory stuff. And
Yep.
Your thoughts? How to make use of your books in more constructive ways?
I think we are, you know, I've struggled a lot thinking about ethnography in general and the ethics of it and who benefits from it. Having done ethnography with my own community and the risks of using people for our own gain, and what do they get out of it. I don't know if I have good answers and maybe that's why I've become more interested in participatory action research, having thought a little bit more about ethnography and the way it's really difficult, that something about the ethnographic process is so one-sided.
Yeah, although as I read, and you're suggesting that, there are more possibilities now for having input and co-writing even. I mean, the book that Leonida and I want to write on our Polymurray group is going to be much more attentive to those contributions and control, etc., over whatever the product ends up you got some more ideas about how to do that?
I've been working on lately, thinking about critical intersubjectivity as a way in which researchers and subjects can be in conversation with each other, so it's not just the researcher thinking about context as if it were outside and the only subject being researched, but that her own context as a researcher is also in play as well. And how do you take into consideration that there are two or more contexts always being in the research mix. I really appreciate your work in creating a breakthrough in terms of reflexivity. That's really important for this. I think that took a lot of courage to do.
Nice. Yeah, I was just thinking today that I need to get more on top of and updated from anthropologists about, their writing on that. Because surely that's gotten, more attention over the past, even 5 years than it did when I was originally doing my ethnographic stuff.
I'm wondering if I could pick up on that last point, because I've also been so very impressed with the reflexivity in your work, and in some ways that's what sort of, your initial sense of embodied discomfort in the Good Samaritan Church is really so much of what drives all of your reflections in Places of Redemption. And it does seem like it is very, very courageous to be able to even recognize those things and then to name them. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your decision-making process as you were doing that research and writing to, ground so much of it in your experience of that place.
Well, this is, my memory's bad, but what I do know is that I had a meeting I didn't do the IRB process back then, which sounds crazy. I wasn't told to do that. This only came up much later, but I did meet with the pastor and members of the community to talk to them about what I was going to do. So I wasn't sort of hiding out, or I got verbal permission from people, and so that's one of my primary memories of how this came about. Now, I gave I haven't gotten any feedback because I don't really have anybody who's read the book that I'm aware of. But more could have been done, for sure. And I couldn't do that today. Nobody could do that today.
I'd like to, I'll be brief.
Did I answer the question?
I think sufficiently, yeah. Right, maybe as much as it can be answered.
Yeah.
I know Dean Moore has to go, so I think I'll give you priority.
No, you
please.
go ahead. I'm fine.
I wanted to point out a question that one of the students has done in the chat room. So if you look on the left side of your screen, Dr. Fulkerson, you'll see the chat room. Duce Lee asks, my question is related to your use of connotations in corporate practices. When several members of the congregation participate in a certain practice, if any, there tends to be forming a sort of power relations among them because of their different ability, proficiency, understanding about the practice, and thus sometimes leading to conflict. Do you have any advice on how we navigate this kind of situation?
Boy, navigate. Well, what that reminds me of is something I don't think is being asked, and that is what it means to be writing about incorporative practices. When you have, I mean, you understand, this gets back to the permission dilemma, because how can you get permission from people to write about their, what I ended up calling, you know, their aversive incorporative practices, practice of, you know, discomfort, white discomfort with what they said were too many black bodies. How do you get permission for that? So I'm wondering what kind of examples would illustrate this, but it's a great question about power differential. When I think of incorporative practices, goodness. I mean, can you think of an example?
Okay. So.
Would it be, go ahead.
Let me invite Ducey Lee to maybe give an example of his own, and we can come back to this question. I want to make sure we have time to speak with Dean Moore. So we're going into kind of a Markan intercalation here. So Dean Moore, would you mind surfacing your question?
Mine was connected to the earlier discussion, so I suggest that we just keep on going with other people.
So I'm going to wait for Ducey Lee to give us further response so we can follow up on his question.
Oh, he's not there. Oh,
no,
okay.
he's in the chat room.
Okay. Oh, gotcha. Sorry.
That's okay. So I'm hoping he'll be able to help that move along for us as well. But in the meantime, let me open it up to anyone else who wants to ask a question.
Well, this question that we're talking about connects thematically, with one that was kind of forming in my mind, and I don't think it's formed. But you know, it has to do with, you know, how do we institute practices of power shifting itself? Like, there are ways in which, and again, I'm just thinking in my own church experience of particular practices, particular structures to try and get these conversations happening, to try and get like worldviews transformed, like put it at the end. But another thing, you know, in the back of my mind, or like in conversation with people of color, whether in my own circles or whether online, is like there's a sense in which it can like only go so far. Like, how does transformed worldview translate into practices that really shift power on a regular basis, so that some of the transformation is happening because white people aren't the ones in control of the practice, or how we shape the practices that's making it happen. Like, that we're not just creating a new vocabulary and creating new understandings, but, and again, this is one of those questions that I don't have an answer for. I trust you have a specific answer right there, right to
No, there's no simple answer. There's no simple answer.
Yeah.
There's no one thing you can do as a white person or as a white community to radically alter social relations. It takes time. It's never complete. At least that's my feeling about, just based on my own experience. I mean, some of the people I've been going to church with now for years and years, we haven't been in a setting where, and I'm talking about people of color, we haven't been in a setting where we've had the kind of honest conversations that some of the others and I have. But I'm not going to say that the honest conversations have fixed everything. So, I mean, that's not an answer to your question, but at least sometimes being a minority matters, it seems to me, you know, not being, but that doesn't mean that all white people need to just go and join black churches. I was talking to Leonida yesterday about that, how it's sort of like that, back to what I said much earlier about how it's white people going and asking people of color if they would fix us. No. At least to have the questions emerge and for us to care about them this is a first step, even if it's not a big step. We're about, in the church that I go to, we're about to start having the whole church engage in honest conversations about race. And there's now an attempt to try to get people to decide which method would be the most helpful. That's the first time that's ever happened in a church I've gone to. And again, this is this interracial church I've been going to for 14 years and haven't done this before. So, and it's connected a lot to some of the, you know, the obvious things that are going on in our larger society. That's sort of what's generated the passion about it. So, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't really have material that I could write a book on that would be strategies for how to proceed if you're a white church. But
Mary, I'm struck with the number of times you've said, I don't have an answer. And I think that itself is an answer in that you've confessed that there is not one way to do research and to be non-abusive or non-intrusive or non-dominating. There's also not one way of doing ministry in your church where you've been for 14 years. This is an ongoing process that unfolds, it changes, it shifts, and so forth, which makes me think about the power issues again. Maybe, I'm going to borrow Courtney's term, critical intersubjectivity. Maybe there's not one way to be critically intersubjective. Maybe, in fact, it requires multiple forms of research, multiple forms of ministry, multiple forms of being community together in order to destabilize any kind of dominance and open new ways of new moments of knowing and new moments of relating. What do you think about that?
oh, that's wonderfully said. Absolutely. And you made me think of something else, which is the recognition. I mean, one of the reasons I don't know where to go next is because I'm not, okay, and put it differently. You have to have a huge stake in something. And while I would argue I have a stake in this, it's not a survival. It's not a matter of survival. I mean, I'm still privileged, whiteness, income, work, et cetera, so I can care, and I can care strongly, and I do. But, is this a matter of survival for me? Is this, do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is, and I'll just have to always be aware of that. But you can't ever be perfectly right or good or whatever. As an academic, I've said this to myself more than once, and that is, okay, you feel guilty because you're a warrior and you're blah, 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 but you can't stop doing it just because it's not, and you need to be open to hearing the critiques and, what needs to be done differently, and, what's coming across about the way I am with you that irritates you or bugs you or seems like standard white person acting like this. In other words, I'm talking about being in conversation with some of my church colleagues. So thank you for your comments.
Well, just back to the forms of research, just for a quick moment. I'm totally on board with everything you've said about being a voyeur and the dangers and the awareness of that. I'm also aware that when people do studies of the sort that you did, and test those studies with the congregation as they do them, and and then leave the study with the congregation. Some of those congregations actually use those studies for their own
Oh.
self-reflection. And in a
Yeah,
sense,
that's
in a sense, you're using your power to be a voyeur. There's no question about it. But in another sense, you're giving up the power of what's going to happen to that study once it's done. That congregation may decide this is something of value, or they may not. But you're not stealing all of their power. That doesn't mean there's not a power relationship. So I'm not trying to undermine that whole discussion that took place.
Right.
I'm just observing that there are different kinds of power relationships in different kinds of studies. And
Yes.
to be conscious
Good
of
point.
those power relationships seems critically important, and that's what you did
Right.
in your study, and what I think you're awakening us all to do in our studies. However we choose to do our studies, and hopefully it'll be not just one way.
Good point, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions about the most updated anthropological writing on ethnography?
No, I've been racking my brain as you were talking and thinking I need to do the same thing you just said you need to do.
Yeah. Concerning with Asian context, I have question about normative Eucharistic practice. I'm a Presbyterian ordained minister of Korea, and I have minister, and I have used communion or prayer book in Korea. I think it is Korean version. However, it is translated from communion of prayer in PCUSA. So, and I have to prepare the Western style bread and wine. I think that you wrote down about importance of stories and memories in the Eucharistic practice. In the Western theology, I believe that it is normal Eucharistic practice that use bread as Jesus' body and wine as Jesus' blood. However, in the Korean context, I believe that Korean people are not related with bread and wine, especially we don't have any story and memories and history concerned with bread and wine. Rather, if Korean believers use traditional rice cake as Jesus' body and traditional juice like raspberry juice, yeah, I think that this body and blood can give memories. I think dangerous memories you mentioned to Korean believers and can assign contextualized meaning. How do you think this culture and indigenous Eucharistic practice?
How do I what?
How do you think this culture and indigenous Eucharistic practice?
That sounds like a great idea. You're suggesting that some Caucasian Americans might need to do a different kind of meal
Yeah.
for Eucharist, I mean?
Yeah.
Is that what you're suggesting? I think it would be great.
Okay, thank you.
Because, I mean, I'm sorry, I apologize if this offends, but sometimes it can just be a boring service. And especially, I know this is not in all churches, but we'll get in line and we'll walk up to the front in line, and then we'll be handed a little piece of bread and walk over, and then we dip it into the cup of grape juice. And I don't find that affectively very significant. I prefer, I've been in another church where we gather in a circle and we pass the elements around to each other. And at least that's a face-to-face communal kind of enactment. So I'm wondering if your example, it communicates some other affective kind of meanings than some of the more boring versions in the US. What do you think?
I think especially Jesus used bread and wine. I think it is daily meal in this in his context. So I think he had stories and memories of bread and wine. So yeah, I would like to use traditional rice cake and it's traditional juice. Yeah, it gives our memory and stories.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But however, some Korean, actually Christian, will be offended if we do that because it's not traditionally, liturgically right.
Right.
So they prefer to have a wine, and they really want to stick to the wine.
Yeah.
And also they really want to stick to the bread instead of rice cake. So there are some debates about that.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I'm not surprised. So would they all use the word traditional?
I think so, yeah.
Why don't you go interview all of them to find out what they mean by traditional?
That was actually my subject, and that was my argument when I wrote my first book.
Right.
That reminds me of a question that was on my mind that I'm able to articulate a little more clearly now. Your book, specifically A Broken Body, seems to suggest that it's important for us to come up with creative, imaginative ways to broaden our liturgical practice. That we need to help the Eucharist be dangerous again. And so I'm wondering if you have experienced or know of liturgies that really bring that out in a more, maybe in a more formal way, for lack of a better term, in a way that's, perhaps incorporated into the church calendar in some sense, or if it just really only is happening right now at an improvisational level, where people just happen to engage in it in this way in a one-time scenario.
Right. That's a great question. I think my answer is going to be that this is simply gesturing toward a future that it doesn't specify very well. I mean, we've given a few examples in the book, but I think an alternative forms of ritual, I think would be great, but I just don't know how to either define or implement those, because so many people, my guess is, are deeply wedded to the current kinds of rituals that characterize their churches. Now, I haven't done a study that I could say proves that. It's just my hunch. What do you think? Do you think many, I don't know, that's just too general a question then, whether many churches would be willing to do some radically altered form of Eucharist?
Well, I'm in the Baptist world now, and that's maybe a little more reluctant, but prior to this I was in the Pentecostal world, and the Pentecostals seem pretty interested in alternatives, and
like what?
And this, I don't think this is limited to the Pentecostal world, but writing your sin down and nailing it to a cross, and then you make a bonfire or something. Hopefully not burning the cross, but the sins that were nailed there. But I keep thinking of the importance of not just breaking bread, but potentially of murdering the bread, for instance. I mean, to kind of use an extreme term, like maybe nail the bread to the cross, and then people go forward to take a piece of the bread. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. Are you writing on that?
No.
I have a response to Matt's question again, and another question for you. So, my sharing is something that my students did to reinterpret the communion by doing it in the dark. So they did it. They did a dark Eucharist with pastors, and they designed a whole liturgy around the new creation. And they did the traditional United Methodist liturgy, but it was all in the dark. And they wove kind of themes around God creating the universe and the days the day that became light, and what is transformed in that. And it was a different way of experiencing the traditional liturgy. So nothing was changed other than the fact that people couldn't see. And it kind of decentered people's experiences enough to help them kind of re-see the same liturgy in a way that they might not have otherwise. So that's just an idea to think about.
What did people think? I mean, what was their reaction?
They were very intrigued. They were very intrigued. Yeah. It wasn't totally pitch black, which I think would have been really decentering.
So they didn't get lost trying to find.
Yeah, and it was with a lot of people. I mean, it was with maybe 150 people. So I think I would do it with a small amount of people first next time. But I think it was a good moment of embodied teaching and changing the space, recognizing our kind of privilege as sighted folk, and knowing that no one was unsafe and that people knew what to do. It was just becoming aware through changing the bodily habituations slightly, that we become more aware of what we're doing and why.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow.
So my question is, if you could say, I was really intrigued by your notion of flexible memory. And if you could say a little bit more about that, and I guess my thought is coming from a context where traumatic memory is so key. How does that square with folks who are sort of stuck with traumatic memory, and part of their identity is so wrapped up in traumatic memory?
Boy, that is a huge question. Because it would be easy for me instinctually to sort of imply that the flexibility of memory needs to include the histories that have not been acknowledged. The history of racism and abuse and so forth. But then when you think of traumatic memory, I don't want to, go too far in terms of inviting memories that would be excruciatingly painful. But that just signifies that I have not thought this through in terms of next steps. Do you have some ideas about alternative forms of memory? And would you want to invoke trauma?
I think that there's a sense in which there are ways in which you can play with the narratives of the community and remember them differently. And maybe that's where that's why I'm intrigued by the notion of flexible memory, is that memory is you never replicate it exactly, and in certain circumstances you can actually play with it, even aesthetically, in retelling the story. So it's not lost, but in some ways it might be recreated.
Right. And what pops into my mind right now is that if, insofar as the church I'm going to actually proceeds with these ongoing conversations about people's different experiences of race, the pastor could invoke some of those stories, not in a way that is invasive or, says so-and-so experienced this, but if the pastor had an expanded awareness of the kinds of experiences people have had, he could invoke those as part of what kinds of memories we need to both be aware of, but also call for redemptive alteration. So that would be one example. Another would be simply to name the kind of abuse that is publicly, not abuse around only racism, but also, the abuse that's experienced by victims of domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. And to have those kinds of realities named in church would be, I think, constructive. Or potentially constructive, depending on how they're employed.
Yes.
So
Is that getting at what you're asking?
Yeah.
One thing that this conversation reminds me of is a community that I participate with called Pub Church that meets here in Boston on Saturdays at 5. And it's kind of a quote-unquote emerging community. But it was founded by some students who were here at the School of Theology about 7-8 years ago. People who sort of had felt themselves very excluded from church communities. And particularly because their experiences of sexual abuse and being excluded because of sexual orientation had not been taken into account within their church communities. And so when I hear this and I think about how we do communion every Saturday, and it's very participatory. So if you're there and you want to lead, you can lead. But we often do a liturgy that is a poem that starts, before Jesus was his mother, and it centers his mother's body, broken and bleeding, and really sacrificed in a way. To sort of change that story, but also really take seriously the experience of trauma, really unspoken traumas for women around sex and just kind of bodies and really in churches and lots of other places. So I think for me, Serene Jones is where it comes to mind as helpful around Eucharist, and Shelley Rambo's work around how you think about a Eucharistic liturgy. I think, and then I work with a congregation on Sundays, and to walk in 2 Sundays ago, and my first parishioner was like, Donald Trump, Donald Trump at me, and and she was like, was my story true? Like, was my abuse was abuse? And I was like, it's literally like 10:55, and now I've got to go do this thing, but it's there. But she can tell me because we let these prayers be in this space, and she can tell me because I annoy about these other things, and other people annoy me, and that practice of not sweeping all of that stuff under the rug is there.
Right.
But it takes hard kind of stuff, and it takes kind of an openness to not having it together and sort of naming the sins of the tradition, for lack of a better word, of saying who's kind of controlling this, and is there a space for people for whom the tradition is really important but who also feel really hurt by it, to come in and say, well, I do want to make this my own, but what does that mean for me to be able to name here? And that is a hard word. We just kind of stumble through it. I was thinking about this question. Sometimes I can take a prayer request in, sometimes I can't. I don't know, it's a lot of give and take around how you do that. But I was thinking about how when we center the experience of those who've been violated even by and within those faith communities who are saying, no, actually, this matters to me and I want to have a role in naming it, that changes idea of practice, it changes ideas of tradition. Just kind of thinking that had come up for me in that conversation.
Oh, absolutely. You're raising such important topics that need to be more regularized. When I think of, when is abuse of women ever actually even named in church is so rare, and it might be on Women's Day or something like that. In other words, it's not an ongoing reality that we might need to be, raising up for, that needs to be addressed. Rather, it just comes to mind when we have the annual day that celebrates women or something.
I need to jump in here. We've run just a little bit late, but I think what that says is we've really enjoyed this conversation and this opportunity to speak with you. I want to point out that Duce Lee has provided some examples in the chat room, so I hope we have a chance to look that over informally afterward. But I do need to bring the conversation to a close. And I want to thank everyone here who's added so richly to this conversation.
Yes.
Especially thank the folks who made this possible too, like Cesar Linares, who's operated the camera here today, and Christopher Knight, who's helped, and I'm sorry, your name again? Aaron, who've really done some wonderful work here to help us have this conversation. But chiefly, I'd like to thank you, and I very much enjoyed hearing you reflect on your research and really engage the very powerful research that's going on here among our doctoral students in practical theology. And I hope you've enjoyed some of the synergy that's come with hearing them reflect on some similar kinds of issues and thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd start to say I'd love to read all their work, but
yeah, that probably could happen actually.
you all are doing really important work. I'm just so glad to hear about it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you again to those who've helped us with this day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.